Set apramatto vyavasaya buddhi. Sedene artena yateta tatra. Parisrabam tatra samikshamanaha. Atta. For this reason, Kavi, the enlightened person, Namasu, in names only, Yavat, minimum, Artha, necessity, Syat, must be, Apramatta, without being mad after them, Vyavasaya buddhi, intelligently fixed, Siddhe, for success, Anyata, otherwise, Arte, in the interest of, Na, should never, Yateta, endeavor for, Tatra, there, Parishramam, laboring hard, Tatra, there, Samikshamana, one who sees practically. Translation. For this reason, the enlightened person should endeavor only for the minimum necessities of life while in the world of names. He should be intelligently fixed and never endeavor for unwanted things, being competent to perceive practically that all such endeavors are merely hard labor for nothing. Purport. The Bhagavata Dharma, or the cult of Srimad Bhagavatam, is perfectly distinct from the way of fruitive activities which are considered by the devotees to be merely a waste of time. The whole universe, or for that matter, all material existence, is moving on as Jagat, simply for planning business or making one's position very comfortable or secure, although one sees that this existence is neither comfortable nor secure, and can never become comfortable or secure at any stage of development. Those who are captivated by the illusory advancement of material civilization, following the way of phantasmagoria, are certainly madmen. The whole material creation is a jugglery of names only. In fact, it is nothing but a bewildering creation of matter, like earth, water, and fire. The buildings, furniture, cars, bungalows, mills, factories, industries, peace, war, or even the highest perfection of material science, namely atomic energy and electronics, are all simply bewildering names of material elements with their concomitant reactions of the three modes. Since the devotee of the Lord knows them perfectly well, he is not interested in creating unwanted things for a situation which is not at all reality, but simply names of no more significance than the babble of sea waves. The great kings, leaders, and soldiers fight with one another in order to perpetuate their names in history. They are forgotten in due course of time, and they make a place for another era in history. But the devotee realizes how such history and historical persons are useless products of flickering time. The fruitive worker aspires after a big fortune in the matter of wealth, woman, and worldly adoration, but those who are fixed in perfect reality are not at all interested in such false things. For them it is all a waste of time. Since every second of human life is important, an enlightened man should be very careful to utilize time very cautiously. 1 second of human life wasted in the vain research of planning for happiness in the material world can never be replaced, even if one spends millions of coins of gold. Therefore, The transcendentalist, desiring freedom from the clutches of Maya or the illusory activities of life, is warned herewith not to be captivated by the external features of fruitive actors. Human life is never meant for sense gratification, but for self-realization. Srimad Bhagavatam instructs us solely on this subject from the very beginning to the end. Human life is simply meant for self-realization. The civilization which aims at this utmost perfection never indulges in creating unwanted things, and such a perfect civilization prepares men only to accept the bare necessities of life, or to follow the principle of the best use of a bad bargain. Our material bodies and our lives in that connection are bad bargains, because the living entity is actually spirit, and spiritual advancement of the living entity is absolutely necessary. Human life is intended for realization of this important factor, and one should act accordingly, accepting only the bare necessities of life and depending on God's gift without diversion of human energy for any other purpose, such as being mad for material enjoyment. The materialistic advancement of civilization is called the civilization of demons, which ultimately ends in wars and scarcity. The transcendentalist is specifically warned herewith to be fixed in mind, so that even if there is difficulty in plain living and high thinking, he will not budge even an inch from his stark determination. For a transcendentalist, it is a suicidal policy to be intimately in touch with the sense gratifiers of the world, because such a policy will frustrate the ultimate goal of life. Sukadeva Goswami met Maharaj Parikshit, where the latter felt a necessity for such a meeting. It is a duty of a transcendentalist to help persons who desire real salvation and to support the cause of salvation. One might note that Sukadeva Goswami never met Maharaj Parikshit while he was ruling as a great king. For such a transcendentalist, the mode of activities is explained in the next shloka. Translation: for this reason, the enlightened person should endeavor only for minimum necessities of life, while in the world of names he should be intelligently fixed and never endeavor for unwanted things, being competent to perceive practically that all such endeavors are merely hard labor. So here we have a section which is going to describe the activities of a person. Previously, Parikshit Maharaj asked what should be done at the point of death, and then Sukadeva Goswami described the universal form and whatnot. So now he gets into a little more detail of practically what should one do with one's life. This is not advice simply for Parikshit Maharaj, who was about to die, but for any human being. And that, of course, is made clear by Srila Prabhupada in the purport, where he talks about the general principles of life and how we shouldn't waste our life on unnecessary material endeavors. So that is actually what is stated in this verse, though we'll find in the next verses there is more or less a concentration on the yoga process, which involves more extreme renunciation. Still, for any human being, there has to be a sense of renunciation. And we see that in this verse. One should not endeavor for unwanted things. So not as we don't endeavor for anarthas, those things which are not really of any value. So we don't strive for those things and put forth our energy in that direction more than necessary to maintain our body. So that's a basic principle, and all human beings have to follow that principle. Those who are more serious may become more extreme in this attempt, and we find yogis who will give up family and luxury, etc., and go to a cave in the Himalayas and practice austerities. So that's a more extreme version of austerity. However, in general, all human beings are meant to do some sort of austerity. In the first canto, there was a symbolic representation of Dharma in the form of the bull. And the bull had legs of satya, etc., and mercy, cleanliness, tapas, or austerity. So there are four principles, of course that's in general, but I would say four principles of human life, not just for yogis, but for people in general. So this is the basis of Dharma, which is for the people in the Vedic society. They all have to follow these principles. They may have different details. For instance, Brahmins will have more strict following of these principles and Sudras much less, but nevertheless, everybody will follow to some degree these principles. And one of them is this sense of tapas, which means austerity, which means giving up things. So everybody in human life to some degree has to limit his enjoyment. That's what the tapas is. So the literal meaning of tapas is heat or fire. The sun itself is called tapas, or fire, because it shines very brightly, and if you stay out in the sun too long, then you get burned, and it's not very comfortable. It's hot. So in other words, that means discomfort, pain, fire, etc. That's the literal meaning of it. When we talk about human beings doing tapas, of course you can simply get pain, unwanted pain. We also have voluntary pain. So that means that we restrict our senses. That's what the tapas is, the meaning for the human being. And that restriction of the senses is a type of pain also, because the senses don't like to get restricted. And we start restricting the senses and we feel very uncomfortable. So that's a little bit of a pain. So we can restrict our eating. We don't eat certain foods. And that's very painful for some people because they want to eat certain foods. And you tell them don't eat it, then they become very angry and frustrated and whatever. And then we can go to more extremes and people fast. They don't eat at all. That's more of a pain. And not many people are inclined to do that, but nevertheless, this is also recommended in the scriptures at certain times you should fast. So in other words, the restriction of the senses is a type of pain, and that's why it's called tapas. But for the human being, it's more or less, we can say, the voluntary pain. That is, a voluntary vows that we take of restricting our senses. This is our tapas. It's not that it's enforced, but it's voluntary. So anyone voluntarily participates in the Vedic system of Dharma. And when he volunteers to do so, then he volunteers to restrict his senses. So a lot of those rules in that whole system of Dharma are this tapas. Can't do this, can't do that, can't do that, can't do that, can't do that, can't do that. Can't eat this, can't eat that, can't eat that. Can't look at this, can't listen to this, can't do this activity. Can't drink this, can't drink that, whatever. This is tapas. So, for people who are very attached to those things, of course, it is painful. Persons who are not attached to it, that's not so painful. And for those people, that they can go up to a higher type of tapas, and they can begin restricting more and more what they eat, etc. So anyway, the principle of this whole Vedic system of Dharma is restriction of the senses. What is the purpose of that? So the ancient sages understood that for the human being, restriction is necessary, not only for spiritual progress, but even for material progress. You have to restrict your senses, which means that the human being without this restriction is wild. And when he goes wild, he's worse than an animal. That's the idea. We see that animals in their state don't have laws, they don't have governments, they don't have, things like that. But they have somehow some restriction. Certain things they don't do. Human being is not like that. He can do just anything he wants all the time, if he's not restricted. So he's the animals only act by instinct and habit and hereditary, whatever like this, and they limit themselves. We don't see the animals overeating in the wild. We don't see fat wolves, fat kangaroos, or whatever out in the wild. If you put them in the zoo, probably you will find them getting fat or whatever. But the birds, etc., don't get too fat or whatever like this. But human beings, so many people overeating. So that's a sign that they're a little bit different. So the human being doesn't know what is natural for him, so he goes to extremes. Not only in eating, but everything. Sex life, drinking, eating, socializing, whatever he does, he can go to extremes, and the animals don't do that. So the Vedic sages understood this, and therefore they say we have to restrict the human being if he wants to progress. If he doesn't, it's unrestricted, he will destroy himself. So this is the danger for the human being. He'll degrade the society, he'll degrade himself, ultimately destroy himself. So therefore, real civilization means there are rules of restriction. Most countries of the world realize this, and they do have even not religious dharma or religious rules, but they have rules of society. The government puts rules down. You can't cheat, you can't lie, you can't kill, you can't do this, kill human beings, etc. And they have some basic rules. So all countries have those rules. The Vedic system is slightly different because these rules are not political rules or national rules or whatever, just legal rules. They actually have their origin in the Vedas. They're coming from sages, saintly people. So the rules are more refined. The rules are a little more particular in the sense what we should restrict is a little more well-defined. What we should not eat, for instance, is more well-defined than in the regular society. Regular human society, what do they restrict you from eating, really? Is there any restriction? They don't really have any rules. But then in the Vedic system, you have so many rules there for restriction. And according to the class of people, from the lowest to the highest person, more and more restrictions, etc. And for a spiritual person, even more restriction. So a lot of rules are there for persons. So all these are defined in the Vedic literature. And the speciality of these rules is not only do these rules help us control our senses so that we can live together peacefully in society. That's one goal, artha and kama. We do artha and kama, but we have to have dharma to do that properly. But it's got a spiritual goal as well. So that's the special goal of the rules in the Vedic society. There's also a spiritual goal, and that is that the whole goal is to realize that we're not the body at all, that we are spiritual, we are Atma. And of course beyond that there is Supreme Lord. So in other words, the whole basis of the Vedic society is not material at all, it's actually spiritual. But in the beginning stages, it may appear to be material, and therefore we have encouragement of dharma and prosperity and whatever in human life. But even those rules are calibrated very nicely to point us in the spiritual direction. So therefore we all have to do tapas. If you want to succeed in the material world, you also have to do some sort of austerity. So Prabhupada mentions in the Nectar Devotion that yes, even the materialist has to do with austerity. So he'll work very hard all week long, and he'll work for 6 hours and 8 hours or whatever he has to work every day of the week. And he may have to work very, very hard to do that. Plus he may have to go to work and come back from work, so he may spend 10 hours a day or more involved in his job. And before getting the job, then he has to study for 10 years or whatever in school, or 15 years in school as well, like this. So you go through a lot of tapas, and nobody really likes that work, and nobody really likes that study to prepare for that either, but they do it. Why? Because they will get some result, that is money. And with that money, then they're free to spend that money, and there's no real rules on how you spend it. So they get some enjoyment that way. So everyone in this world does some sort of tapas. They control their senses to some degree. Some people have less ability to do that, therefore they don't succeed too well. They don't get very good jobs, or if they work, they don't work very hard, and then they give up that job and they'll relax for a while, then they get a little job and then they give up that job again. So their sense of tapas is not very strong. People who are a little more ambitious for a little more enjoyment in the world, they'll do more tapas. So even in the material world, you have to do this type of tapas. But as I said, the Vedic system is not simply doing this austerity or tapas to get material things, but ultimately to guide you in the spiritual direction. Okay? So that is what is mentioned here in this verse. One should not endeavor for these useless material things, which, in other words, you should renounce these material things and not have not strive for material enjoyment unnecessarily. So that's the basic principle. The Vedic system is also practical, so therefore it does provide people their maintenance, which we call artha. So everybody is allowed to survive, and you have a right to survive, so therefore the Vedic system has laws by which you can support your body. So these are basically the varnas. You get certain occupational duties, and you work with those occupations, and you should get your livelihood that way. So everybody has a right to live there, to support their body. So that's recognized. However, that's not the final goal of life. So we have rules so you can practice your occupation steadily and get your results and support yourself. But then we have other rules so that you are encouraged to start this spiritual journey and to start inquiring, what's my real goal in life? Why do I really exist? Why do I live at all? And the Vedic scriptures also give us an answer to that. So one whole section of the Vedas is dedicating to give us answers to that spiritual question. As part of the Vedas dedicated to providing rules so that we can get our material means. This is the Dharma section, Dharma Shastras, etc. And this involves artha and kama, that is basic material necessities, and restriction on our desires, our kama. And we have all sorts of rules for that. But then the other is spiritual, how to develop spiritually. So the Vedic literature provides both things, how to survive with your body and get your material necessities. Based on that, then we can go further and inquire about spiritual life. So the Vedas are very practical, and they realize without the body you cannot practice spiritual life at all, so therefore they give us practical ways in which you can survive in this world as an individual and as a society. As I said, when we go to spiritual life, when we have some who will go to extremes. So we have the yogis who are described, who practice extreme renunciation. They may give up eating, drinking water, etc. And they even regulate their breathing, so they stop their breathing even. So that's extreme. And that is not a practice that everybody can follow very easily. It's only for a few people. So not many people are qualified for that process. If one is qualified for it, one can do it, but that's very rare. So for other people, of course, who cannot follow that process, they can still practice spiritual life. So the easy way of doing that is the process of bhakti, where there is a sense of austerity. At the same time, it is balanced out by not overemphasizing this idea of giving up everything and stopping eating and going to a cave, etc. So we can say this is like the middle path, just as Buddha advocated the middle path for a long time. The first part of his life was absorbed in material enjoyment, where he was in the palace and he saw all the material enjoyment. And then he walked outside one day and he saw sick people, dying people, etc., suffering people. And then he began to inquire, well, this world is miserable. It's not such a wonderful place. And then he left the palace, and then he was wandering around and he practiced austerities like yogis, etc., for some time. Then eventually he came to the realization that this is not going to work. We can't do these extreme austerities. So therefore he said, we don't want to enjoy the material world. It's also useless. It's Maya, it's illusory. So then he introduced middle path, a little more practical. It's not too austere, and it's not involved in sense enjoyment. So that is basically what the path of bhakti is. It's a middle path in which we realize that we're not the body, we're the soul, but we do have to maintain the body. And not everybody is qualified for extreme austerities. So therefore, we have some restrictions on the body, but not complete restriction on the body and the senses. And at the same time, we engage in spiritual activities. So the reason for this extreme position of yogis and gyanis and other sages to renounce everything is because they view the material body, the senses in the body, and the mind as being the enemy. And this, of course, is true. It's due to these that we end up in the material world, in Maya, in illusion. So therefore they have a hatred of the senses, mind, etc. So they want to give these things up severely. So they restrict everything. Restrict the senses, restrict the mind, etc. The devotees do not view the senses and the mind and the body in the same way. Not an enemy. As Prabhupada mentions here, let's make the best use of the bad bargain. So yes, in one sense the senses and the mind and intelligence and all this are useless because they drag us into Maya. But since we do have them, and we have to maintain our body to practice spiritual life, why not use them? So therefore, we use the material body, mind, and senses not for dragging us further into illusion of material enjoyment, but for practice of spiritual life. So we have ways in which we can engage the eye and the ear and the nose and the tongue and the touch and the hands and the feet in such a way that they don't affect us materially and cause more illusion. So that is, we engage all these senses in bhakti yoga. We dedicate all of these activities to pleasing the Supreme Lord. And this way, we also engage the senses, we maintain our body, but we advance in spiritual life. So that's the middle way. It's not too austere. At the same time, there is a recognition that if we don't engage our senses properly, they will drag us back into the material world. So we have to engage our senses in a certain way. So ultimately, the process is that how do we engage these senses? Because the senses are actually, generally they go to material objects and we enjoy them. So the process of bhakti is we use the senses. So we see forms with the eye, we taste tastes or what flavors with the tongue, we smell fragrances with the nose, we hear sounds or words with the ear. Instead of using that experience for ourself, for our own enjoyment, which is the usual process that takes us into enjoyment and then into illusion or Maya, we utilize that experience to establish our relationship with Krishna. So, in other words, we see the form of the deity, and we appreciate the beauty of the Lord. We appreciate the form of the Lord. So that may look like a type of pleasure for ourselves, but actually by appreciating the form of the Lord, this is the type of bhakti. If we can appreciate and say, oh, how beautiful are Krishna's eyes, this helps us develop spiritually. So by appreciating the Lord's form, by appreciating his qualities, by appreciating his name, hearing his name, or singing his name, glorifying his name in kirtan, we actually develop bhakti in the jiva. And we establish our relationship with the Lord. So this is spiritual development. So the result of our engaging our so-called material eye and ear and whatever, and voice, is that we develop spiritually instead of going into the material world. So therefore the senses don't have a material function anymore. They have a spiritual function to help the soul develop its love of Krishna. So that's the basic idea behind the process of bhakti. So though in this section there is concentration on the yoga process, etc., and withdrawing the senses from material things, ultimately we'll find that in this section the yogi concentrates his meditation, his thoughts upon the spiritual form of the Lord. So therefore he engages his mind in meditating on the spiritual form of the Lord. So this is another way of, say, engaging the mind, not materially but spiritually, and through that he can get spiritual progress. So therefore when we realize the nature of this material world and the material body and the material senses, we should try to utilize them in a proper way so that we get spiritual effect, not material effect. So that's the basic idea here in this verse. Any question there?
It's not a question actually, but I was just, if I can find it again. Sorry, it's disappeared off my head. But I heard it. In the 5th canto I was reading the other day, 14th chapter, it talks about this austerity and this kind of thing, and he says that one may be, Prabhupada says, one may be rich, learned, beautiful, or high-born. One who has all these aspects know that they are all meant for the advancement of Krishna consciousness. Unfortunately, when a person is misguided, he misuses his high position for sense gratification. Therefore, the uncontrolled senses are considered plunderers. The good position one attains by executing religious principles is wasted as the plundering senses take it away. One may very easily use his assets for the further advancement of Krishna consciousness. One should understand that the wealth and opportunity one gets in the material world should not be squandered in sense gratification. They are meant for the advancement of Krishna consciousness. This Krishna consciousness movement is therefore teaching people to control the mind and find knowledge acquiring senses by definite process. One should practice a little austerity and not spend money on anything other than the regulative life of devotional service. The senses demand that one do different things, therefore money should be spent for decorating the deity in the temple. Similarly, the tongue has to taste good food, which should be brought and offered to the deity. The nose can be utilized in smelling the flowers offered to the deity, and the hearing can be utilized by listening to the vibration of the Hare Krishna mantra. In this way, the senses can be regulated and utilized to advance Krishna consciousness. Thus, a good position might not be spoiled by material sense gratification in the form of illicit sex, meat eating, intoxication, gambling, and probably goes on about the plundering senses that comes
a very good analysis of how to engage all of your senses in your mind. And he calls them the plunderers there, yeah? Because if we misuse our senses, they take us all over the place and we ruin our whole life. So the idea there is that though we're engaging our senses, we're getting a spiritual result. the jiva is developing his devotion for the Lord. So this is something very, very special. But it's also very easy to do. So that's the interesting thing about bhakti as compared to yoga or jnana or whatever. By trying to control the senses too much, we end up in a lot of difficulty. It's very, very difficult for most people to do. So we can get rid of our karma that way by yoga, but it takes a long, long time, and it's very, very difficult for us to do. So we see in chapter 12 of Bhagavad Gita, this is called kleshadikara. That is, it causes a lot of suffering to the body to follow this process of going for liberation and entering into Brahman through jnana or yoga. It can happen, but it's very, very, very difficult to do it. It's full of klesha or suffering on the way. So the process of bhakti is easier. We engage, instead of stopping the senses and mind, we engage them, and we get a much better result. That is, the soul develops not just Brahman, but actually develops love of Krishna. So we get a higher result from it as well.
I think it's in 11th canto where Krishna says,
Needs to be taken.
Krishna says that in relation to the yogis, if they perform austerity, harsh austerity, it hurts him, to the soul. You remember that? At some point he says that not to perform, I think probably austerity is a mode of ignorance or whatever it is, but he said at some point he refers that it hurts.
It injures the soul, the super soul.
Something like that.
Oh, it gives pain to the super soul or whatever. I think maybe he said Bhagavad Gita or something like that. Oh, yeah, I think Bhagavad Gita. Yeah, in the mode of ignorance or whatever. Well, the thing is that obviously the soul or the super soul cannot be harmed in one way. You cannot burn the soul. You cannot drown it. You cannot do anything to the soul or damage it with weapons. So obviously super soul also, the Supreme Lord Paramatma, cannot be harmed in any way. So not in that sense. But obviously the Supreme Lord doesn't like you to damage your own body or act in a tamasic way and torture yourself and all of this. So in that sense it's not approved by the Lord. So in that sense the Lord feels the pain or whatever in that sense. Those things which are not approved by Scripture, that those are the things the Lord doesn't, who are going to disturb the Lord or cause him pain. If they're approved, fine. But then something like yoga, okay, it's approved for some persons, it's not approved for everybody. So if a person in the mode of ignorance does the yoga process for a very, very tamasic purpose, that is maybe controlling people, harming people, etc., by his yogic powers, etc., and then to do that he may cut off his arm or sacrifice his body in fire or whatever like that to Shiva. All these type of tamasic type of things for tamasic goals. That's not pleasing to the Lord at all. Very, very. It's not following the Vedic process at all. It's not going for spiritual life. It's using or exploiting a spiritual process for a material, a gross material goal. So that therefore it's not approved by the Lord at all. It's displeasing to the Lord.
The Asa, you find yourself many times working very hard for some corporates, and your mind is totally absorbed in, providing, getting money, selling, doing that. How can you connect these activities to Krishna?
Well, if you get very involved, it's very difficult to connect it with Krishna. That's why people if they get overworked like this and over pressurized, then they tend to forget the spiritual goal completely. So therefore, to get such jobs in the first place is not very favorable for devotional service. So we have to choose work or jobs or whatever to support ourselves, which are favorable, so that allow us to keep the spiritual goal in mind when we're working, and not to make us just forget and concentrate on the material goal too much. So if there's too much pressure to achieve success materially, then obviously we're going to forget the spiritual goal. So therefore such things are unfavorable. So we have to choose more favorable type of work.
Just a quick comment also. If you are having to work so hard, Prabhupada always recommended that you give 50% of your profit. So 25. So you offer your whatever activity you have to do for your family. You also give to the temple and to Krishna deities to kind of balance it out. So you're not just working for yourself all the time, using all the fruits of your actions, but sacrificing
So in other words, we have to be a little detached in our material endeavors, otherwise we get too attached to that, and then we get overworking for those material goals. So we always have to maintain a little balance and understand that the whole goal is not simply to get the money, but we have, if all we're going to get it, we have to also contribute spiritually and whatever like that. So in that sense, maybe we can balance out our material endeavor with a spiritual goal at all times, if we can keep that such a principle in mind. Of course, at a certain point, I think probably it may be an over-endeavor also. If the goal is too high or whatever, then we can fail again in that sense, because we have too much pressure to try to do both things, and we don't succeed at all. So we have to also not set too high a goal probably in that regard, but always keep a spiritual goal in mind.
So also we have to offer our austerity to Krishna.
Yeah, well, everything has to be related to it somehow.
A lot of times I see people that they're doing austerity, they're fasting, and then after 3 days they say, I'm feeling so good right now. So it's kind of like the fasting is actually, it's a little self-indulgent. It's like, I'm actually going to get a really good result from this, and I'm going to feel good. So the sacrifice is not necessarily, or the austerity is not necessarily offered to Krishna, or Krishna food. I want to become immortal or something that I starve myself.
That's why we generally don't emphasize the austerity aspect or the fasting too much. So we have, Ekadasi, let's fast on Ekadasi twice a month for 1 day. And you're not supposed to fast for 2 days in a row. You have to break the fast the next day. So that's the idea, that you shouldn't prolong your austerity too much and overstress yourself or whatever like that. So when you start doing that, of course, you can get into a little competition on how long you can fast for and how much better you are than other people at fasting, etc. So that's not really the goal. The whole goal of this fast is to remember the Lord. It's called the Day of the Lord. So the whole goal of fasting is to remember Krishna more. And if that doesn't happen, then obviously the fast is for some other purpose or is useless. Okay. Hare Krishna.